Plywood is one of the most popular building products in the U.S. today. It's also man-made, which makes it stronger and more durable than ordinary wood. The process of making plywood begins in the log receiving yard.
That is a lot of trees.
We go through a lot of trees. It takes about 80 truckloads a day just to run the plant.
What kind of trees are they?
They're southern pine. It's a real strong tree.
Georgia Pacific uses 100% of every tree that comes through this yard. But the thickest log is only 30 inches in diameter. So how is it going to turn into a sheet of plywood 8 feet long? Well, plywood isn't made from one piece of wood. It's actually made of several thin layers of different sized wood, sandwiched together. And the first critical step in making those thin layers is to strip the logs clean. A chain conveyor hauls the 1,000-pound logs to these 3 spiked rollers, which guide them through the cutters. These rotating carbide, or carbon and metal teeth, furiously chew away the bark. The blade spins so fast you can barely see it. Its carbide teeth last up to 20 times longer than steel and completely strip the entire log in less than 20 seconds. So these 7 massive steel circular saws slash the logs into 8-foot-long sections.
What's the next step of this process?
We'll put them in the soaking vats, and what we're doing there is getting the log hot and soft.
The logs get pushed into these huge vats. Each vat holds 26,000 gallons of scalding hot water. The 200-degree moist heat softens the logs like potatoes in a pot. Eight to 10 hours later, these potatoes are ready to be peeled. With this, the lathe. The lathe spins the log and pushes it against 2 55-inch blades. The blades peel and unroll up to 60 feet of wood from each log. The lathe can peel an entire log in less than 14 seconds. Each peeled sheet is thinner than a pencil. And nothing goes to waste. The leftover cores get recycled into 2x4s.
All right, so I admit it, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen. How fast does it spin?
It'll come off of the lathe at about 1,000 feet a minute.
So like every 5 minutes, a mile of this stuff is going by here. So where is this beautiful sheet headed from here?
It's going to go through what's called the clipper.
The clipper cuts these strips of wood into different size sheets. The lower line is for the narrowed sheets, while the overhead conveyor handles wider sheets. These different size sheets will form the layers or plies of the plywood. The outer and center layers of this plywood are called wide sheets. The grain of these sheets runs in the same direction. Sandwiched between them sit the smaller crossband sheets. Their grain runs perpendicular to the grain of the wide sheets. This combination of layers gives plywood its strength and its stability. These wood sheets are still wet from the soaking vats. They need to be dried before they're layered and glued together. The wide sheets and crossbands are sent through this 100-foot-long stainless steel dryer. The dryer tightens and shrinks the wood fibers and makes the board stronger.
As this wood comes in front of us, it's passing underneath the machine that's checking it for moisture.
These electrically charged wire brushes check for any remaining moisture in the wood by measuring how well the wood conducts electricity. If the wood is still wet, more electric current will pass through the wood. And wet wood prevents the glue they use from adhering to its surface. Now it's time for the dry plies to be graded.
So she's just eyeballing this?
Exactly. She's looking at each sheet, making a selection as it goes by her as to which bin it's going to go into.
A worker only has about 2 seconds to look at each sheet and give it a grade.
How do you grade a piece of wood?
They're letter grades, A, B, C, and D. Rule of thumb, the prettier the sheet, the better the grade. And that sheet there with knots in it, that's going to be a C grade. Okay. Now, some of these sheets are going to have just a few knots. So we've got a machine over there that we can actually repair those sheets called the Skoog machine.
A scoop machine.
Skoog machine.
The Skoog machine punches out any small defect and replaces it with what's called a football patch, a small strip of wood covered in hot glue. Finally, it's time to assemble some plywood. First, one machine feeds the wide sheets onto a conveyor, while this machine spits out the smaller crossbands onto another conveyor. When the two conveyors merge, a worker lays the crossbands on top of the wide sheets.
And those crossbands, the wood grain is running in the opposite direction of the ply underneath it. That's where the strength of plywood comes from. We take these sticks and just cross them like that. That's a pretty strong piece of wood. And that's what plywood is in a nutshell.
Then they spray a layer of glue in between each piece of wood to bond the plies together. But it's going to take more than glue to keep these layers intact. Now that workers have assembled these stacks of thin wood 5 layers thick, a conveyor carries them to the first of 2 presses. This press compacts the stacks for about 5 minutes, keeping them together long enough to make it into this, the hot press. This steam-heated press consists of 46 trays, each holding 1 stack of plywood. When the trays are full, the press retracts the stacks and squeezes them together while heating them to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. The glue in between the layers is actually thermoactivated. That means it takes heat to activate its adhesive properties. This hot press has a maximum force of 200 pounds per square inch. This plywood may look finished, but it isn't regulation size. It still must be trimmed down. So the equalizer saw slices the plywood exactly 4 feet wide. And the Skinner saw trims it to 8 feet long. Then this 8-arm Ferris wheel flips the boards to allow a worker to inspect them for defects. Plywood with cracks or holes gets a facelift at the polypatch line. Here a worker uses a gun loaded with synthetic putty to patch the defects. Finally, a sander smooths the surface. And this plywood is ready for shipping.